Story number 1. A Real Monster. When I was younger, Halloween used to terrify me. I was scared of my own shadow. I had a nightmare every night, and I used to wake up screaming that there was a monster in my closet or hiding underneath my bed. I know, I sound pathetic. One night, my dad decided that he was tired of me being scared of everything. It just happened to be the night of Halloween, and he was determined to take me out trick-or-treating. I was around 10 years old at the time, and I hadn't gone out on Halloween night at all. There was no way I was going to run around with people in frightening masks and scary costumes, but my dad insisted. At the time, I hated him for it, but now I see why he was doing it. Anyway, as far as I can remember, the night wasn't that bad. He took me to a few houses, and I got a lot of candy. I was terrified at first, but my father helped me see that none of it was real. He told me that real monsters don't exist. It was only later that night that we realized he was wrong. I had gotten my fill of candy, and eventually my dad walked us back home. This was years ago, so not all of the details are fresh in my mind. If I remember correctly, my dad seemed a little worried while we were walking home. He kept looking over his shoulder at something. Whenever I looked to see what it was, all I saw was a street filled with parents and their children. Once we got home, my dad rushed me inside and eyed the street for a while longer before coming in himself. I had no idea what was happening at the time. I was far more interested in my candy. A few hours later, my mom took my candy away and told me to get ready for bed. I remember not being scared that night. I used to stay up all night scanning the shadows for monsters. I would even grab my flashlight that I kept hidden under my pillow, and I would check my closet and underneath my bed at least 3 times before finally going to sleep. I didn't do any of that. I closed my eyes and went straight to sleep. I'm not sure why, but I woke up in the middle of the night and it was dark. My nightlight had run out of battery power and I'd forgotten to plug it in. At first, I wasn't that bothered. I wasn't feeling as scared as usual, so I lied in the dark for a while. Then I started to wonder why I woke up in the first place. I reached underneath my pillow and felt around for my flashlight. My hand wrapped around the flashlight just as I heard something rustling around behind me. I froze. I can't properly describe the amount of fear that I felt in that moment. My hands were shaking, and sweat started to drip from my forehead. I slowly pulled my flashlight out from underneath my pillow and turned around. I clicked the flashlight on, and the bright beam lit up my room just as something darted down behind the board at the foot of my bed. I gasped and pulled my knees up to my chest. My initial thought was that there was a monster hiding underneath my bed. I remembered my dad telling me that monsters aren't real, and that's probably the only reason I had the courage to climb out of my bed and check underneath my bed. I shined the flashlight underneath my bed, half expecting to see some kind of terrifying monster sneering back at me. Instead, I saw boots at the base of my bed. They weren't my boots. They were big enough to be my father's, but I didn't know why his boots would be in my bedroom. In that moment, they moved. I gasped again and fell back. I crawled backwards, grabbing at the carpet with my hands and clawing my way towards the bedroom door as a tall figure stood up from the bottom of my bed. They towered over me. I had dropped my flashlight, so all I could see was a glint in their eyes as they glared down at me. I let out a scream and rushed out of my room. I ran straight across the hallway and into my parents' bedroom. My parents were used to me running into their room and screaming about monsters under my bed, but they didn't expect me to start talking about a man with boots standing by my bed. My dad leaped into action and rushed into my room. He found the window to my bedroom wide open, but no one was there. My mom called the police and my dad rushed out the front door with a bat. He stalked the neighborhood, searching for someone. I never fully understood what happened that night until my parents explained it to me recently. On the walk home, my dad noticed that someone was following us. That's why he'd been acting so strange and why he leaped into action. That same man who'd been following us climbed through my window that night. I'm not sure what he was planning on doing with me or how long he was in my room before I woke up. The thought always sends chills down my spine. My dad was wrong. There are real monsters in the world, and I saw one of them when I was younger. Story number 2. Lost Little Lamb. I love my little sister. Say what you want about that, but it's true. She means the whole world to me. There was a time when I almost lost her, and that was the most terrifying moment of my life. It was Halloween night, and trick-or-treating is something me and my sister love to do together. We usually dress up in matching costumes. The year before this story, we went as Batman and Robin. I was Batman, and of course, we got so many compliments. The year that this story takes place, my little sister wanted to do something different. She said she wanted to be cuter. I can understand that. I thought she looked pretty cute as a little Robin, but she was more of a princesses and kittens type of girl. So I let her pick the costumes, and before I knew it, we were going trick-or-treating as Little Bo Peep and her little lamb. Obviously, I was Little Bo Peep, and my little sister was the little lamb. I have to say, she looked adorable, and I didn't look too bad myself. We got so many compliments. Now, at the time of this story, I was around 17 years old. As much as I loved doing things with my sister, I'll admit that the trick-or-treating was mostly for her. I hadn't gone trick-or-treating since I was a lot younger. There was a Halloween party that night, and I really wanted to go. I didn't want to let my little sister down, and my parents would have never let her go out on her own. I made a decision that night, and I've regretted it every day since. I decided that I'd take her out for some trick-or-treating earlier in the evening, and then stop by the party on the way home. I knew she wouldn't mind because she also just liked being around me. Anyway, we headed to the party a little earlier in the night than I was expecting. My sister was getting tired, and I knew she wanted to go home soon. So, we skipped the last few houses and went straight to the party. I had hoped to go later in the night when most of the people had gone home. That wasn't the case. When we arrived, it seemed like the party was only just getting started. The music was loud, the people were loud, everyone was drinking, and it was easy to get lost in the crowd. That's exactly what happened. I keep blaming myself for that night. I was having too much fun. I got distracted. I looked away for 1 second, and when I looked back, my sister was gone. I went straight into panic mode and practically screamed her name out at the top of my lungs. Everyone gave me worried glances and annoyed glares. I was ruining their party vibe. I didn't care. I searched the crowd for her, but she was so small and there were so many people. My heart was beating out of my chest, and I struggled to breathe every second I couldn't find her. Even though the music was so loud it deafened my own thoughts, I heard a deep voice somewhere in the crowd. I didn't recognize the voice. I didn't know where it was coming from or who it belonged to. The only reason I chose to follow the voice was because of what I heard it say. It said, "It's a lost little lamb. How cute." There was something about that voice saying those words that made me sick. It was as if something took over me. I followed that voice, through all the chaos and all the noise, until I found my little sister. She was trapped, surrounded by a group of tall, rough men. It wasn't hard to tell that these men were drunk. They were barely able to stand up straight, and most of the words coming out of their mouths were slurred and unrecognizable as English. I wasn't thinking at the time. My only thought was for my little sister's safety. I saw one of them reach down and grab her arm, and I pushed forward without thinking. I slammed my shoulder into the guy, knocking him out of the way and into his friends. I made a path through their group and grabbed my little sister. She wrapped her arms around me as I lifted her up and carried her away from them. I could hear them laughing, and I'm pretty sure they would have followed after me if they weren't too drunk to walk. I got my sister out of that party and took her home. I was so grateful to have found her safe and sound. I was expecting my mother to bite my head off when I got my little sister home, but thankfully my little sister didn't tell her anything. She kept it between us. She really is the best part of my life, and I don't even want to think about what could have happened to her that night. The thought of losing her scares the hell out of me. Story number 3. The Big Storm. It was about 3 years ago when Halloween night brought us the most horrible storm we'd seen in ages. I didn't actually have anything planned for Halloween that year. I was starting to see it as a boring holiday meant to fool parents and children into giving all their money to the candy companies. Anyway, even though I had no plans for Halloween, I was still looking forward to spending some time alone at home. That didn't happen. The storm outside meant that the streets were flooded, and my parents weren't able to take my younger brothers trick-or-treating. We were all stuck at home. It wasn't a bad night. We ordered some Chinese food and rented a few movies. My parents promised that after they sent my brothers to bed, I could watch some horrors. Honestly, it was turning into the best Halloween ever. The night turned sour really quickly when my parents got a call from the Chinese restaurant we ordered our food from. Their delivery driver was only riding a tiny scooter, and there was no way he was going to be able to reach us in the storm. My parents got into their car and left to fetch the food. My little brothers couldn't stay still, so they begged my parents to let them go with. Long story short, I ended up alone at home just like I wanted. I wasn't sure how long they'd be gone, so I put on one of my scarier movies and made a bowl of popcorn. The storm only got worse outside. The howling wind threatened to blow the tiles off the roof. The rain slammed against the windows and the doors even rattled. None of it bothered me, but then I heard a knocking at the door. Now, I can't overstate how bad the storm was outside. The streets were properly flooded and the wind looked like it was trying to blow the trees away. My parents had left before it got worse, otherwise they might have suggested sandwiches for dinner instead. Anyway, it was extremely unlikely that anyone would be out on the streets in that weather, and yet someone was knocking at the front door. I hesitated at first. After all, why would someone be knocking at my door, in this storm, so late at night? I eventually got up to check who it might be. When I looked through the peephole, I didn't see anyone standing on the other side. I reached for the doorknob, but just as I was about to pull the bolt aside, something stopped me. Call it a sixth sense or instinct. I cleared my throat and called out, asking who was there. It was silent for a moment, then a soft, deep voice replied, "Trick or treat." You're probably thinking it was some poor child who simply insisted on getting some candy, even though the weather was horrible and his parents didn't care enough to tell him not to. That wasn't the case. It wasn't a child's voice that responded, not even close. This voice was deep and sickening. I pulled away from the door. After a few moments, they knocked again, and I yelled at them to go away. That was when the same deep and sickening voice asked me, "Are you alone in there?" It wasn't just the question that tied a knot in my stomach and made a knot form in my throat. It was the way he said it. There was a certain glee in his voice, as if learning that I was alone inside the house was the best thing that could have happened to him. I ran to grab my phone and tried to call the police, but the storm outside meant that there was no signal. I couldn't even get a hold of my parents. I had no idea when they would come back home, and I didn't know if this man would be waiting outside for them when they did. It was the most terrifying night of my life. I just sat in a locked bathroom for what seemed like hours. I couldn't get a hold of anyone. I was completely alone, and I could hear the man knocking on the front door the whole time. At some point, I realized that he wasn't actually knocking, and that it was the wind banging against the door. I'm not sure how long I was hiding in the bathroom, but I only came out when I heard my parents opening the front door. I was completely alone before then. You can't even imagine how horrible it is, knowing that you are completely alone and that no one is going to come and help you. That night was the scariest night of my life.